The Chancellor's challenge in making her sums add up was made considerably harder this week by the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the UK's official but independent economic forecaster. It's expected to downgrade its forecast on productivity. That's the efficiency of the economy. And that will knock a multi-billion-pound hole in her finances, which is one of the reasons we're hearing so much about tax rises lately. The OBR is now so central to a government's judgment of what it can afford to do that we thought it worth having a look at its role and power and whether it is deserved. And Evan, I mean, we should start actually with history because it's a relatively recent...
George Osborne did it 2010 when the Tories came in with the Lib Dems. They said the problem is the Treasury was always producing forecasts. You've always got a forecast. And a lot of external observers felt the Treasury's forecasts, when they were just making them up themselves, may have been tainted by just a little bit of optimism that would be helpful to the Chancellor or not. And so it was kind of like, if we get someone independent to do the forecasting for us, maybe that will have more credibility.
I mean, there was such cynicism when one remembers budgets pre-2010 is when they came out, people would almost laugh at some of
it. And, do you remember Gordon Brown? So Gordon Brown's solution to this problem of how do you make your fiscal policy look credible was to have fiscal rules, the golden rule, which was to balance the current budget over the economic cycle. So this is all ways of trying to anchor policy in something that looks particularly to the markets, like we know what we're doing. But he had this rule about balancing the current budget over the economic cycle, but no one really knew what the economic cycle was. And that gave him a lot of wiggle room, which he ultimately, by the way, did have to exploit in order to say, I've passed my rule, but by defining the economic cycle in a way that gets me through it. And so there was kind of lots of questions being asked. And it's worth remembering, for all the criticisms thrown at the OBR, that the system prior to the OBR was not considered absolutely perfect.
Which is why there's a former member of it, Andy King, who described it as a guard against politically motivated wishful thinking.
Correct.
That's the point of it.
So think of it as like the fiscal equivalent of an independent central bank. Again, central banks were created independent so that they would not be like timing interest rate cuts to meet, elections and by-elections and the like.
So we laugh at the forecasts from before. Have they proved their value? I mean, has their forecasting been better than previously? And I suppose...
Well, it's a really good question. And in fairness to them, they do a lot of work on what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong as forecasts. And they broadly speaking, say we're as good as anybody else. We're not wildly, different. Their assessment, I'll just read this because they do publish their own analysis of whether they're any good. They've said, the OBR's economic and fiscal forecasts have been somewhat pessimistic in the near term, so they're too pessimistic about next year, and they're too optimistic in the medium term. So we're too optimistic about where we're going in 5 years, but we tend to be a bit pessimistic about the next year. Now, I mean, they actually find a lot of forecasters are in a similar position. And the reason is that we've been through a rather bad number of years in our economy, since 2010, since 2008 crisis, where growth hasn't been there. And one of the big questions that forecasters have to decide is that kind of ability to grow, our productivity, is that going to bounce back to sort of its historic norms? Is it partially going to bounce back there? Or should we just say the lackluster, dull, low productivity growth we've had for the last few years is now the new normal and the new permanent? And essentially the OBR, in their kind of medium-term forecast of where the economy is going in 5 years' time, they've tended to think there'll be some bounce back in productivity growth. And it's just year after year, they've kind of said, we'll probably have a little bit of bounce back in productivity. And then it never comes. And this time is the time they're saying, you know what, we probably ought to just say that bounce back isn't coming. And,
I mean, there is an astonishing graph where you can see that because it's a gradually moving up line but with different trajectories, there's a sort of what they've projected is a sort of straight, as if it's just going to head straight on, which I mean, presumably that's what a forecast is to some extent, but it does make them look ludicrously optimistic.
Well, it does make them look too optimistic, but it's not. You see, I would challenge your word ludicrous there. You have to make some assumption about which period of history is our normal.
Okay.
But they've been more optimistic. It's fair to say they have been more optimistic than others on that productivity. So they're now coming into line with the rest of the world.
Okay, and it's that which suddenly creates this hole.
Yeah.
So and perhaps this illustrates just how important they are. That they adjust their forecast. Suddenly people are saying, oh my goodness, there's a £20 billion hole that did not exist last week. And, the Chancellor's got to fill it in a month's time.
And that is, I think everyone would agree that is not the right way somehow to be doing fiscal policy. It's like we've changed the maths a little bit. Oh, we now need to raise taxes by 30 billion. It's just, that surely can't be it. Now, there is a solution to that, Sarah, which is, I think, what the OBR would like, which is, because the OBR, by the way, are the ones more aware than anybody else that their forecasts are flawed and need to be updated and changed. It's not like these people are kind of swaggering confident about what they're saying. They do their best and they say, there's a lot of things that can change. It's everybody who's the non-economist, I find, who kind of fetishizes the forecast and assumes it must be right.
Except, hold on a second, the Chancellor. Is the Chancellor fetishizing the forecast?
Well,
Should she turn around and say, look, they admit they're getting it wrong?
The point is, because they get it wrong, they would say, if you're going to set yourself a fiscal target or a rule, don't just leave yourself a smidgen of headroom in doing that. Because, of course, the forecast's going to change quite a lot year by year. And suddenly you'll be breaking your rule or passing your rule or breaking it again. So you basically want to be, if you're going to design a fiscal rule, perhaps design it so that you've got you've got enough buffer to smooth the ups and downs of forecast changes.
OK, well, so this kind of goes to the heart of some of the criticism, because, for example, when the Welfare Reform Bill went through earlier this year, a chair of the Commons Work and Pensions Committee, Debbie Abrahams, in the final debate, she's Labour, she described it as a dog's breakfast because, of course, it had been gutted. You remember, they're trying to raise £5 billion. Then they gutted it. And she made the point, dog's breakfast, driven by the need to get 4 points to the OBR to enable it to be scored for the budget. Now, you're saying that isn't a criticism of the OBR.
No,
that's a criticism of how much headroom you say.
Exactly. So it's not... The OBR is, I think, best seen as a messenger rather than a policymaker. If the Chancellor would have been perfectly free to say to the OBR, we aren't going to get you the welfare savings I'd thought I was going to be getting, but I'll give you 4 billion or 5 billion of extra taxes, which will get the fiscal picture back to where we thought it was going to be. Now, the Chancellor doesn't want to make that decision, but all the OBR is doing is trying to keep track of how much the government is spending and how much it's borrowing, and it needs to forecast the economy in order to know how much tax revenue will likely be coming in. So I think it's hard to blame the OBR if the politicians find themselves tangled up in trying to persuade the OBR that we'll get over the line on this and we won't get over the line on that.
Well, we should, of course, mention another politician who got into trouble as a result of not using the OBR, which was Liz Truss.
Yeah, so we've had one big fiscal event since the OBR was invented without the OBR being involved and being invited to score it and assess forecast the outcome. And that was the Liz Truss mini budget, the quasi-Kwarteng mini budget. Now, that didn't go well. And
part of the reason, though, was that people saying, you haven't scored it.
Well, the markets are like, what are you scared of that you won't get some independent folks who can look at the maths and say what the implications are? And so far from blaming the OBR, really the constraint on the government's ability to borrow and to do so cheaply are the willingness of bond investors, bondholders, to lend the money to the government. And the bondholders would rather the politicians had some kind of external discipline against them.
Except, she thinks it should be abolished. And part of the argument is that it ends up driving fiscal policy. And is there an argument that it's too short term? That if you are thinking longer term, you should perhaps say, hang the OBR, what I'm doing, assuming you don't freak out the markets, what I'm doing ultimately will be in the long-term interests of the economy.
Well, I think that politicians are free to do that with or without an OBR. I mean, you can say, these are my plans. all the OBR will do is say this is what we think the effects of those will be over the next. And you can say to the OBR, can you assess these over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, because we're taking a long-term view here. But I would just say that whatever decision you're making politically, whatever goal you're expressing, and whatever policy you're trying to outline and get the OBR to assess, I do believe the bond markets will be more comfortable for the fact that you've had some external criticism. Now, Liz Truss would say, well, I was doing something that was outside the economic consensus. It was like you've got this kind of orthodox way of thinking that totally dominates the OBR. And I, Liz Truss, think that's wrong. I think they're wrong, and they're going to score it in a way that's very unflattering and makes it look like, sort of in conventional economic terms, a disaster. But actually, this is going to liberate the economy and make the economy strong. And, she's entitled to say that. The OBR is entitled to judge it on its own terms, and the markets are entitled to make their own judgment. Do they believe that the UK economy is going to be strong in 15 years because of the tax cuts Liz Truss is imposing? Or do they believe the OBR and its dull, conventional, orthodox economics, which says when you cut taxes, you have less money? I mean, these are decisions that all the OBR can do is tell you what it's doing and to make those forecasts. Okay. And you and the markets will use those forecasts as you want.
Help me, though, with the timing, because the OBR presumably can decide when it's making its judgments. For example, the downgrade to productivity. I mean, there is an argument it could have made it before the election, that it fell on Jeremy Hunt rather than on Rachel Reeves, or indeed that it's judging what the market is doing at any one point.
Yeah, I think there's some validity in that argument. It's like, why OBR are we getting one big jump in the productivity assessment? Why haven't you been slicing a little bit off each fiscal event, each forecast over the last 5 years? I think that is a really interesting question for the OBR. By the way, that question will come up, I think, on budget day. I think the OBR will be asked why this and why now and why not.
When you're trying to make plans.
Yeah, people have been trying to make plans. They haven't been keeping a lot of headroom for reasons which are understandable as it happens. I mean, not wanting to put up taxes to have sort of savings. And suddenly you've sort of whacked them with one very big adjustment. And we'll hear what the OBR says about that. I mean, I think the OBR will be saying, look, we've been working on our forecast. We've been working on assessing our forecast. We published a big thing in March about how well our forecasts are doing. And it is that has prompted us to decide we need to make some changes. And that's the kind of constant updating. But I think I can see why it must be very irritating to a chancellor to be told you're getting the big once-in-a-decade adjustment to some of our assumptions.
Just a month before.
And I mean, at the moment, they have to do two forecasts a year. We're trying to have one budget a year. And the sort of sad thing for the chancellor is if she gets a forecast midway between two budgets and it shows her off track, well, then she's kind of got to have another mini budget to sort of get things on track. And I think there are some things you could think about trying to do, but to solve that. But all these problems would be solved if you made your fiscal rule a rule that you were meeting with 25 billion of headroom, and then it would be unlikely that mid-year or even mid-assumption change you were going to be driven to making fiscal policy. But by the way, it's worth saying, I mean, the other thing the OBR do, which I think is good, is they do really long-term fiscal analysis. We never cover this, Sarah. I don't know why we don't make a thing of it, but they do say, where are we going to be in 2050 as opposed to 2030?
I'm sorry, my immediate thought, Evan, is if they're wrong, kind of
in
like
2030, yeah.
Why would we cover it? Because surely this is, you look at those graphs that constantly change and you think, how can you predict that far ahead?
Well, and it is worth saying. It is worth saying. So look, you've got a line, a graph, a growth rate, and obviously in 5 years, a difference of 0.3% in the growth rate does make a difference of tens of billions in 5 years' time. in 25 or 30 years' time, it makes a huge difference. But it is interesting, Sarah, it is interesting to plug in some bog standard assumptions and say, just extrapolate everything through to 2050 and see where we are. And the news isn't very good. We've talked about this before, with aging population and such like. The news isn't very good as to where we are in 2050. And I think there is a sort of sense, politicians, you've got some tough decisions to make about what the state does, how much it spends, how much you're willing to tax. And I think it is right for there to be someone who's just saying, hi, guys, think about this. It is something you need to address.
So here's this OBR, which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know what it stands for. Sounds rather dull, and yet it has a profound effect, actually, on all our lives.
Yeah, you're right. They have a profound effect, and it's good that they have a profound effect. But let us not think they have some sort of oracle status in which they hand down tablets of truth. I mean, they are just doing their best, like the rest of us.